Chapter 47. Down in the Dungeons. The kitchen workers in the palace were most surprised to hear from Lord Spittleworth that Mrs. Beamish had requested her own separate kitchen because she was so much more important than they were. Indeed, some of them were suspicious, because Mrs. Beamish had never been stuck up in all the years they'd known her. However, as her cakes and pastries were still appearing regularly at the king's table, they knew she was alive, wherever she was, and like many of their fellow countrymen, the servants decided it was safest not to ask questions. Meanwhile, life in the palace dungeons had been utterly transformed. A stove had been fitted in Mrs. Beamish's cell, her pots and pans had been brought down from the kitchens, and the prisoners in the neighbouring cells had been trained up to help her perform the different tasks that went into producing the feather-like pastries that made her the best baker in the kingdom. She demanded the doubling of prisoners' rations to make sure they were strong enough to whisk and fold and measure and weigh, to sift and pour, and a rat catcher to clean the place of vermin, and a servant to run between the cells, handing out different implements through the bars. The heat from the stove dried out the damp walls. Delicious smells replaced the stench of mould and dank water. Mrs. Beamish insisted that each of the prisoners had to taste a finished cake so that they understood the results of their efforts. And slowly, the dungeon started to be a place of activity, even of cheerfulness, and prisoners who'd been weak and starving before Mrs. Beamish arrived were gradually fattening up. In this way she kept busy and tried to distract herself from her worries about Bert. All the time the rest of the prisoners baked, Mr. Dovetail sang the national anthem and kept carving giant Ickabog feet in the cell next door. His singing and banging had enraged the other prisoners before Mrs. Beamish arrived, but now she encouraged everyone to join in with him. The sound of all the prisoners singing the national anthem drowned out the perpetual noise of his hammer and chisel, and the best of it was that when Spittleworth ran down to the dungeons to tell them to stop making such a racket, Mrs. Beamish said innocently, "But surely it was treason to stop people singing the national anthem." Spittleworth looked foolish at that, and all the prisoners bellowed with laughter. With a leap of joy, Mrs. Beamish thought she heard a weak, wheezy chuckle from the cell next door. Mrs. Beamish might not have known much about madness, but she knew how to rescue things that seemed spoiled, like curdled sauces and falling soufflés. She believed Mr. Dovetail's broken mind might yet be mended, if only he could be brought to understand that he wasn't alone, and to remember who he was. And so every now and then Mrs. Beamish would suggest songs other than the national anthem, trying to jolt Mr. Dovetail's poor mind onto a different course that might bring him back to himself. At last, to her amazement and joy, she heard him joining in with an Ickabog drinking song, which had been popular even in the days long before people thought the monster was real. "I drank a single bottle and the Ickabog's a lie. I drank another bottle and I thought it heard its sigh. And now I've drunk another, I can see it slinking by. The Ickabog is coming, so let's drink before we die." Setting down the tray of cakes she'd just taken out of the stove, Mrs. Beamish jumped up onto her bed and spoke softly through the crack high in the wall. "Daniel Dovetail, I heard you singing that silly song. It's Bertha Beamish here, your old friend. Remember me? We used to sing that a long time ago when the children were tiny. My Bert and your Daisy Do you remember that, Dan?" She waited for a response, and in a little while she thought she heard a sob. You may think this is strange, but Mrs. Beamish was glad to hear Mr. Dovetail cry, because tears can heal a mind as well as laughter. And that night, and for many nights afterwards, Mrs. Beamish talked softly to Mr. Dovetail through the crack in the wall, and after a while he began to talk back. Mrs. Beamish told Mr. Dovetail how terribly she regretted telling the kitchen mail what he'd said about the Ickabog, and Mr. Dovetail told her how wretched he'd felt afterwards for suggesting that Major Beamish had fallen off his horse, and each promised the other that their child was alive because they had to believe it or die. A freezing chill was now stealing into the dungeons through its one high tarny barred window. The prisoners could tell a hard winter was approaching, yet the dungeon had become a place of hope and healing. Mrs. Beamish demanded more blankets for all her helpers and kept her stove burning all night, determined that they would survive.